Welcome back. Well, the US Electoral College members are due to start voting today, well, tonight our time, on who'll be the next president of the United States. So the makeup of the Electoral College is determined by the votes in individual states. The bulk of those votes in most states went to the Democrat candidate Joe Biden. That's despite several court challenges by the incumbent President Donald Trump. Robert Schrire is an Emeritus Professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Cape Town. Professor, good afternoon to you. I mean, it's quite a strange system. Ours is much better and much simpler, I would argue. In the end, in the United States, you don't vote directly for the president. You vote for someone to vote for you. That's quite strange.
Well, it was really a compromise. One of the essential problems is where our Constitution is, 20 years old. Theirs is more than 2 centuries, and it was a different world. And of course, they haven't been able to change it. It's very difficult to change. 2/3 of the Senate, Congress, and then 3/4 of the states. You can say it's virtually impossible. So they stuck with this horse and buggy Constitution. And if you go back to the foundation of the Electoral College, it was really in large part because of the fear of democracy. And also, slaves, African-American slaves, played a major role, because in states like Virginia, huge population of African-American slaves, obviously they didn't want them to vote, but they wanted them to count. So partly, a slave counted about 70% of a white male, and therefore they could get more votes that way, at least more weighting. So the Electoral College is, first of all, slavery. Secondly, the problem of democracy. The American system was not designed to be democratic, at least not fully.
That's fascinating. Is it possible that the electors that are sent by the states don't vote for the people that they've got a mandate to vote for? Now, I would like to think that would never happen, that people would be honourable. But American politics in 2020 has been so mad that, frankly, anything can happen.
Yes, fortunately, it can't happen because there's been a compact which, for a majority of states, means they have to vote for the electors who put them there in the first place. But you're absolutely right with Mr. Trump in the White House playing every dirty trick in the book. You can be quite sure if he could change the vote, he would. And there are, in fact, ways in which Congress could play a role, and that is if there is a total impasse. But I think we can safely say that the last die of the cast was the Supreme Court, and the electors are going to elect Joe Biden.
President Trump, as you say, still claims the election was stolen. His Twitter account is still really quite busy. This is sort of the final step. I mean, there's sort of 2 steps in this process, as I understand it. There's still another one in January. But I mean, he's going to look a little bit silly or sillier after what happens tonight, isn't he, after the Electoral College votes?
It's hard to understand somebody like Trump because he doesn't think the way you, presumably we're both fairly normal, or at least in the normal realm, and Trump makes no sense. But if you're very Machiavellian, you could say he's laughing all the way to the bank. With his spurious claims of election rigging, he's raised $200 million, which in fact is not going to be used for court cases. It's going to be used to finance his political career. So on the one hand, you could say that this is all rather stupid, heavy-handed. He's going to be humiliated because Joe Biden was elected and will enter the White House. On the other hand, if you see it as part of a political strategy, you might say actually Trump is laughing all the way to the bank, literally.
Trump, I mean, again and again is saying the election was stolen, but Biden, in a way, perhaps is playing quite a careful game. Staggered announcements, giving the impression of governing or preparing to govern, cabinet announcements, sort of policy announcements around face masks. Trump, on the golf course, a fair amount, I'm afraid. I think it's fair to say. Has Biden actually played quite a clever game? The perception is perhaps that he's been taking power, he's been preparing to govern. Does that work for him?
Yes, I think we've got to see it on 2 levels. On the level of statesmanship, I think Biden has played it very cool. He's decided not to get into the mud with Trump, not to try and answer the Rudolph Giuliani's and all the other nonsense. But on the other hand, you might say politically, nobody has challenged the Trump scenario, if you will, the Trump reconstruction. So, the talking heads all know it's nonsense, but there hasn't really been a proper refutation from Biden. An alternative approach might have been if Biden had held a national press conference with a VIP panel around him and, in a sense, tried to make a rational case for the election. So, in the one sense, Biden has been the statesman, he's gone up the high road. The negative is he's left the field open to Trump and Fox News and Newsmax and all the other counterfactual organizations. So there's only really been one debate or one scenario, and that has been the Trump scenario.
The US is hugely divided, and sometimes if I spend any time on Twitter, I sort of see those divisions actually here. I mean, only in the United States, to my understanding, has the decision around wearing a face mask become a political statement. And people who do wear face masks tend to have voted for Biden, and people who don't tend to have voted for Trump. Those divisions aren't going to go anywhere. I mean, Biden is going to have a very tough time in government, right?
Well, I think it was pretty tough before, because we really are now talking about two nations. The red nation, which ironically, since we think of red as left, but to them it's the right wing, and the blue nation, which is, of course, the Democrats. And so these two are two totally different worlds. I think perhaps one of the most shattering statistics I saw was that today something like 70% of Republicans would hate it if their daughter or son married a Democrat. Now that shows you it's almost worse than white and black in South Africa, that there are these two totally different worlds. And I think the negative consequence of this election has been, as we know, that a majority of Republicans believe that Trump won. So we're in a post-truth America where the facts don't matter at all. Trump has, I think, I've seen the figure, he's made 25 or 50,000 total lies in the last 4 years, and nobody calls him up on it. So America was two worlds to start with, and those two worlds have become even more firmly entrenched. It's going to be a tough job for Biden.
There's a much bigger conversation around populism now. Part of it is around social media, Facebook and Twitter. Part of it is around the fact that people now no longer agree on the same set of facts. So let me take an obvious example. You and I might agree that Nelson Mandela became president in 1994, for example. I mean, in some cases, people in the United States just won't agree on the causes of COVID-19 or how it's transmitted, something as basic as that. And this is really about populism. We see it in Europe as well, to an extent. And Brazil. Is populism around the world, I mean, can it be put back into the bottle? Can someone actually put toothpaste back in the tube?
I'm afraid it's something we're going to have to deal with and live with and try and neutralize, because there are really two elements. The first element are the fact that many people are unhappy, and people have always been unhappy throughout history. The second aspect, which makes it so uniquely dangerous, is they now have the Twitter, the Facebooks, they have this echo chamber, so that the middle has disappeared. In the old days, there was the village newspaper, which had to try and reflect both sides. Today, you're either MSNBC or Fox News. So the normal unhappiness, the grievances from globalization now have an echo chamber, and that echo chamber is very dangerous, because we might well see, even in a country as relatively well governed as the United States, a lot of post-election violence. If 70% of Republicans feel they have been robbed, and maybe 1% of that 70% are young activists who will do something about it, we can see almost all societies facing increasing violence, dissidence, and breakdown of national consensus.
There's national consensus, but how important is economics to all of this? I mean, one of the reasons that was widely given for the fact that Trump was able to beat the then Democratic contender Hillary Clinton was that the current sort of generation of white Americans feels poorer than their parents, and certainly feels, in what are called the flyover states, sort of laughed at by someone like Trevor Noah, for example. I mean, if the economy were suddenly to gel, say in post-COVID-19 kind of world, once a vaccine is going, if people will take them, I mean, aren't you going to find perhaps if the economy grows, some of that feeling, the move to identity politics, could that sort of resolve itself or lessen in some way?
I don't think so. I think economics is very important in the background, but it's actually one of the myths that poor whites, uneducated whites have supported Trump. If you actually look beneath the surface, you can see that many middle class, upper middle class people, in fact, supported Trump. When I go overseas to America lecturing, I'm generally speaking to groups of mostly white Americans who are very affluent, upper middle class and beyond. And the majority of them support Trump. So it's not so much economic as it is cultural. There is a feeling among white Americans, the majority of whom supported Trump, that somehow they are at a disadvantage. It's one of the mysteries that this happens. I think perhaps an analogy would be India. India is 80% Hindu, and yet the Bharatiya Janata Party, Modi, have sort of built a political career on claiming that Hindus are being discriminated against, are becoming marginalized in their own country. So it's feeds on many things, but I would say culture and identity are more powerful than, in fact, economics.
Professor, I really appreciate the time. Thank you. Professor Robert Schrire, an Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Cape Town. We could talk forever about populism. I'm afraid that maybe we will. Professor, thanks very much.